Welcome to TERRA's third Thursday video podcast for the month of August 2025. Today, we will be having another strategic discussion designed to help your organization maximize your e-scrap and ITAD operations. I am your co-host, Stephen Napoli, president of TERRA, the Electronics Reuse and Recycling Alliance. For our regular consumers of these sessions, you know that we strive to be brief and to the point while providing you with useful information to enhance your knowledge, operations, and bottom line. As a reminder, all of our previous content is available on our website, jointerra.org. But quickly before we get started, we would like to acknowledge our new and returning members since our last session. These organizations include Mender, Critical Technology Services, Guardian Data Destruction, Lead Park Enterprises, Dynamic Lifecycle Innovations, eWorks, First America, and METEC. Today, I am very pleased to welcome Brett Robinson. Brett leads FMI Capital Advisors' ITAD and e-waste recycling practice. He has a proven track record in the e-waste and ITAD sector, having recently advised a leading Southeast ITAD on its successful sale to a large public strategic acquirer. At FMI, he is passionate about partnering with entrepreneurs to navigate the complexities of a transaction and secure a legacy that reflects their life's work. For over 70 years, FMI Capital Advisors has specialized in guiding founders through their most critical transition, whether that involves a strategic sale to a private equity or a corporate buyer, a family succession plan, or an employee stock ownership plan, an ESOP. Their process is built on a foundation of trust, transparency, and an unwavering commitment to maximize value for their clients. In today's session titled, Unlocking Your Company's Next Chapter, a founder's guide to maximizing value in a strategic sale, family transition, or ESOP, we will discuss strategies for owners and employees to implement a successful succession plan for their business. Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of TERRA's Third Thursday podcast. I'm here with Brett Robinson, and as I mentioned in the pre-log, we are going to be talking about unlocking your company's next chapter. This is one of those subjects that, for me, has been kind of on my mind for a long time, just because I've been going to these trade shows and I've been involved in this industry for multiple years. I'm seeing more of the guys that, I saw when I first got into the business starting to get a little gray on top. So they got to start thinking about, what does their next chapter of their business look like? How are they going to get the equity that they've built out of their companies out? And how are they going to enjoy their retirement years when they do ultimately come? So we're going to be exploring that with Brett today. But before we get started and talk about all the different potential options that are out there, I am going to give Brett an opportunity to introduce himself and his company. So Brett, if you could take it away.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and really appreciate the invite to be on this podcast. And this is a topic that very passionate about, and it's what I've spent my whole career doing. So maybe a brief intro on FMI Capital Advisors. We are a leading investment bank that serves exclusively the built environment. And a big part of the built environment is environmental services. And then I lead within our environmental services practice, our e-waste and ITAD, I guess, subsector vertical. So again, e-waste, ITAD, it's a growing sector, very excited by, the opportunities that are in that space to work with, incredible founders that have built really successful companies. But there's also, it's a highly fragmented space where there's a lot of companies that, as Stephen, as you just mentioned, founders are getting to that age where they're thinking of the next chapter of their life, and that usually means either selling their company, or and there's lots of ways to sell it, but really just figuring out that next transition plan for the company, and that's what we do at FMI is working with founders to unlock that value and make sure it's a win-win transaction, and it's obviously values one consideration, but there's a lot of other considerations that I'm sure we'll get into. So within this space, we recently closed a transaction where we helped a founder sell itself to a very large strategic public company, and that one closed earlier this year. So it's a space that we're highly relevant in, and always looking to help others. So happy to share views and perspectives on this podcast.
Oh, definitely appreciate you being here, Brett. And I think, just for everybody that's listening, this is ultimately this conversation is not just for people that are owners. I think if you're an employee of one of these, ITAD or e-scrap firms, you know, you're going to be looking at your owners thinking at some time they're going to be passing the business along. And perhaps you want to be part of that process. So we're going to be having those conversations as well as, how as an employee, if we've got some time at the end, really, having those discussions with your owner and approach how to approach them about, potentially becoming an owner of your business or investing in your business in some manner. So this is one of those podcasts that's for everybody. Um, you know, our space is, kind of unusual. There are just a couple of 800-pound gorilla companies in it, and most of them are entrepreneurial, small one, two facility kind of companies, most likely, under 100 employees. And those are, again, scrappers, guys that got into the ITAD business and, are smart, entrepreneurial, but, not necessarily can wear all of the hats that it requires to run a business. Not everybody's a marketing person, not everybody's an operations person, not everybody's a finance person. And, very few of us know going into starting a business how ultimately we're going to sell it. So, having, the kind of expertise that Brett brings to the table, I think is really exciting for us to have as a conversation today so we can share that knowledge with you all. But as Brett mentioned, there are kind of like three categories that we're going to be discussing today. First of all, it's like just how do you sell your business? Just outright sell it to, an investment group or another company. We're going to be talking about, maybe potentially passing it on to the next generation of folks, whether that be an internal group of, folks that have been with you for a long time, your VP of, sales, your senior vice presidents, that sort of thing, or looking at it as, what? No, my son's now in the business, or my daughter's now in the business, and I want to pass it along to a family member. And then we'll be talking a little bit about ESOPs, employee options. And if time serves, we have a little bit at the end. We're going to talk really have a conversation about how you as employees can get involved in this process too. So, Brett, with that kind of set up and kind of these three different categories we're going to be rolling into, tell us a little bit about I'm an owner. I'm 55 years old and, I'm starting to think about transitioning my company and I just kind of want to sell. What are my options?
Yep. Yep. So this is the classic founder's dilemma. The core challenge every successful founder faces is, they've worked extremely hard building a valuable enterprise, in a complex industry like ITAD e-waste. And, for most private business owners, over 80% of their wealth is going to be tied up in this business, or, I just made that number up, but there's a significant chunk of their wealth tied up in this
Right.
business. So you have a situation of concentrated wealth, and you're looking for ultimately a liquidity option, right? That's what selling the company is, and
Hmm.
this is going to fund a partial retirement. There's obviously valuation and getting money out at this step is important. But then the other part that we'll get into is obviously the legacy of what you've built, and making sure the blood, sweat, and tears, everything you've put into for the last multiple decades is going to be the culture, everything's going to stay with it, and
Hmm.
that part matters as well. So the first, and Stephen, kind of to go into kind of the first one you talked about is selling your company to either a strategic firm or a private equity group, which in the industry people sometimes abbreviate as a PEG, private equity group.
Hmm.
Um, Now this method, or this, I guess, alternative, when you're thinking through this, usually comes with the highest top line valuation. And the reason for this is a strategic buyer is, as you mentioned up front, Stephen, there's only a few 800-pound gorillas in the space, but they
Yep.
understand the space. And usually if they're going to buy your facilities, they can pay a premium, because there's usually going to come with synergies of them buying your facility.
Right.
And typically that's either them wanting to expand their geographic footprint or adding new service capabilities like, the the person selling may or may not have, or gaining market share. So, that's kind of the first bucket is a strategic sale, which again, usually they can pay a high valuation.
Right. If you
Um,
got capital, you can afford to pay a premium.
exactly. And these, these companies have deep balance sheets. Some of them are publicly traded, call it to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of enterprise value. And these, while we're talking big dollars for a founder, this is a rounding error on their balance sheet. So if they find the right business, they can and will stroke the check to get the deal done.
Hmm.
So that's the first bucket. So happy to go into more detail as you see fit, Stephen, on that one.
Yeah. So, I mean, for an owner, it's like, yeah, I'm thinking about that, but I don't know who these people are. How do I get in touch with them? I'm willing to sign on the dotted line today if somebody writes me the right offer.
Yep. And that's I will say, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this podcast, a lot of founders are getting approached, sometimes unsolicited, by these buying groups, either private equity funds that have strategics in the space and are trying to consolidate the industry, or sometimes it's private equity groups that don't have a platform in the space, but like the long-term thematic around recycling, especially in regards to data center and electronics broadly defined, and they're looking to find a platform in the space. Or it could be as we mentioned, a large strategic that, just also is reaching out unsolicited. So sometimes finding these groups, they come to you unsolicited,
Mhm.
which you can think, oh, great, someone wants to buy me. I should enter into maybe, discussions with this person who reached out. I would suggest running a competitive process. And this is where you'd want to work with a financial advisor who traffics in this space. Because if you just enter into a bilateral negotiation with one group that has approached you, they're ultimately, when it comes time to close the deal, they're going to have all the leverage because you're now invested in doing a deal with them, and they know that, so they can kind of name, they not that these groups sometimes do this, but it's called the retrade, where they start negotiations and you think one price or one set of terms, and then as you get further along, you're more pot committed. They may be having this discussion with four or five other groups, so they
It's
don't
just
necessarily need to
it's
buy
just fishing.
you.
They're just reeling you in
Exactly.
slow, and they
Yep.
want you to bite the bait that they want to offer up to you.
Exactly. So this is why you want to work with a financial advisor to run a competitive process amongst multiple buyers. And that really creates competitive tension. Even on the
I'm sure
process.
also it's flattering, if somebody comes up and potentially you could be spending all kinds of time and resources putting
Yep.
together, P&Ls and, information for this potential buyer. They may just be using you as, fodder for another deal.
Yep.
And, then you don't have any representation. You're just kind of left hanging with the
Yep.
wasted time and no offers.
Yep. Yep. So even on the transaction we just closed, we went out to over 75 potential counterparties. And there's even more to go to, but we down selected based on, this particular region, et cetera. And it resulted in a double-digit number of offers. So it allowed us to really, kind of control the bargaining position. So if someone, decides to, you know, as you
Cut
said,
bait.
leave you at the table. You have a lot of other counterparties that you're already in discussions with. So you're not reliant on one counterparty when you're going through this process. And you have to do a lot of work to sell your business through, like you said, Stephen, preparing P&Ls, having what we call a data room, because anytime someone's going to write a check, they want to do due diligence before they
Yeah.
write that check. So a financial advisor will help prepare you for all of the data and different documents that are needed. And if you're going to do all that work, you might as well, show that to multiple counterparties at the same time and run a competitive process. So that's really the value add of an advisor is running that process, knowing who to contact to have these potential bidders in your process, and then ultimately when it comes time for for them to put in bids, really kind of negotiating with those counterparties to extract, the highest and best price from each of the counterparties that are, that have been, in the process.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. So that's the private that's the sale or the private equity route.
So that's the sale route. And then
Yes.
within the sale route, and I'm glad you kind of brought this up, there's really two buckets within the sale route. There's the strategics, which are, just to name, a few, it's the large, call it, the Iron Mountains of the world. There's, multiple others, but it's the large companies that,
Have the
honestly
wherewithal
do.
to buy market share and buy some additional
Exactly. And
red
these
checks.
companies acquire five plus, other ETAD players, sometimes a year, they're very active in the market. And then there's the second bucket, which is the private equity groups. And then that bucket can be further refined into private equity groups that have an e-waste investment already. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of examples of those, Sage, who is owned by closed loop partners. But there's call it a dozen plus of those groups, and then there's private equity groups that may have other recycling platforms that aren't in e-waste, but really like recycling in general, or just like business services platforms and have expressed an interest in buying an e-waste platform, but don't have a current investment. So that would be kind of the two different types of private equity groups, one that have an existing e-waste platform and one that are looking to get into e-waste ITAD.
That latter group, I think, is growing. I think people are starting to
Yes.
recognize the value of this industry and
Yep.
seeing that, to a certain extent, and that's one of the reasons I think Terra really created Terra, so that it's fragmented.
Yep.
Um, that logistics is a big part of it, and if you could shrink those things down and be more efficient with the material you collect by having a large geographic footprint or a large, you know, diversity in the kind of materials that you can handle based upon your size and locations, that there's economies of scale to be had there. And
Yep.
people are looking at that, seeing as hey, there's potentially some simple consolidation out there available if we're able to, acquire a couple of companies in some strategic locations.
Yep. Yep. Completely agree. And it's, I would say a lot of those private equity groups that are looking to get into the space are looking to back companies that have already a decent amount of scale and size, but also companies that they believe can then further consolidate the industry. So acquire other companies as well. So if you're a founder and you are looking to potentially, especially if you have a management team that is looking to grow through inorganic acquisitions, and all you're missing is capital, those private equity groups will really find your story compelling if you think you can consolidate the industry. So they would obviously provide capital to buy you out, but then they would also bring fresh capital to allow you to then acquire other
Mhm.
I guess, platforms in the space or assets that may come to market in the space using either your existing Rolodex or, kind of just being out in the market. And then you would have your capital provider ready to do those deals because they obviously just bought you out and oftentimes these private equity groups want you to roll some of your equity into the platform. So they'll buy you out and they will recapitalize you, but you'll still keep a little bit of your equity, and it's called a rollover in the new platform. And that just aligns interests. So again, even if you're ready to retire, sometimes they'll want you to stay on board just as a strategic advisor and make sure that next layer of management is really
Keep those
ready to
personal relationships going, keep some skin in the game. Makes
exactly
sense.
skin in the game. Yep. And it makes you still, it just aligns interests. So both, the new buyer group and you still have, as you said, skin in the game to, make sure it's a great outcome, on both sides of the transaction.
Well, good. Well, let's see. Let's move it along.
Yep.
With the 17-minute mark already, but let's keep going. Let's move into kind of like section two. We're going to talk about, that next generation, whether that's your
Yes.
internal folks or maybe family or other
Yep.
people that are external.
Yep. So this path is really for founders who prioritize, continuity, culture, keeping the business in the hands of its trusted employees.
Hmm.
Um, it's this is different than just selling your company to an outside group, obviously. This is usually done or effectuated through a highly structured transaction. And it's structured, when I say structured, it's over a multi-year period. And it's using the company's profits and a combination of seller financing and usually a little bit of bank debt to fund the buyout. And we'll kind of get into that more, but really the primary benefits of this is you're keeping the company's culture and this, and as you know, Stephen, a lot of these businesses have a community impact. You
Oh,
just
certainly.
you know who you're selling to, and it's someone that's been with you for sometimes multiple decades, and maybe doesn't have the capital today to give you the headline value a strategic or private equity group does. But you trust them that over time, with the company's profits and a seller note and a little bit of bank debt, that you can still get to close to the same answer, but you feel a lot better about the legacy that you've built, selling this, internally.
Hmm.
So that's, at its highest level, that's what the second bucket is. And I would say what's important for founders on this is you really want to start this planning process early. This isn't a quick transaction. This is usually a multi-year process. In order to do this, you need a robust management team that you want to, obviously hand the reins
Hmm.
onto, but you also need a plan in place, to effectuate this ownership transaction. And you really do want to align interests because in this type of structure, the seller, you are financing a large part of the deal. So you're going to remain at risk throughout this buyout period. So it really requires, I would say, immense amount of trust and a clear alignment of vision between, the founder and that next generation.
Right.
Um,
But
and
ownership doesn't convey immediately. So, I mean, an
yes.
owner is protected to a certain extent because they still have majority shares until the point that they don't.
Yes, and that's where working again with, trusted advisors in the space can help really make sure both sides of the transaction get what's called a fair deal, right? And
Hmm.
and for the seller, you you want to sell it to the next generation, but you definitely want to have it structured in a way where if, things go, wrong, you have an ability to
Step
step
back
back
in.
in and obviously protect your investment, and then once, like you said, this is usually over a multi-year period. Once you've been paid back a fair amount, then usually that ownership transfers 100%, and then that next generation has full control. But during that interim period, structuring a deal that, protects the founder is really critical. And there's multiple ways to effectuate that. And obviously on this podcast, don't have time to kind of go through all the nitty-gritty
Right.
structural features to do that. But that's where working with an advisor can help, make sure it's structured in a way that effectuates your goals.
Yeah. And I've been involved with some companies that, being my business being in the before I started here was with marketing and advertising, with advertising agencies being sold and bought out by next generation folks. And, my experience has been, and I think a lot of people's experience has been in that, is that, you empower the people around you to be owners in the company grows faster because now they've got the skin in the game too.
Yep.
And it also helps with things like did we have the right internal controls in place? Because now everybody's looking at the business like it's their business, and you find I think you get more out of your people and you get more out of your system. So for for an owner that's looking at that, or for employees that are looking to be part of that process, that can be a real win-win as long as it's structured properly.
Correct. Yep. And usually, these are for businesses that, don't have any current debt. So you can go to a bank and we would help, or any advisor would help go to a bank to create, it depends on the business, how much debt capacity you have, but you can put a little bit of debt on the business, and then that debt actually goes to the owner, the selling owner, as cash up front. But
Mhm.
again, once you add debt, that's adding risk to the business. So that's another consideration to what you just mentioned on just, the considerations. And that's obviously a source of capital, but it does come, with inherent risk because as everyone knows, banks are always the first to get paid back. And if you don't, they obviously, then get the collateral of the asset. So there's a lot of different I guess, toggles that you can pull on to, and figure out what makes the most sense. And really it boils down to, understanding the business and understanding, really the financial model or the business model, and what is the right structure for these transactions,
Mhm.
to harmonize exactly what you just mentioned, kind of that win-win scenario between the founder and that next generation that's buying the business.
And is that different? Is that differ at all for maybe family members that could have been, kind of, involved in the business, but more on the outside? It was, mom or dad's business, and now they're kind of they're coming in and taking it over.
Yes.
What is that structured a little bit different in that scenario? Because now you
Yeah,
may have
so
somebody
I
that's
would
more of a
say,
novice is now the new president of the company.
yep, yep. And we see, when it is truly within the family, those transactions usually incorporate a little bit of a gifting component, and it's different than if it's to the next generation of managerial leaders that, are not part of the family. Just usually what we find, and this makes inherent sense, is if you're handing it down to someone in the family, let's say son or daughter, you may still want that person to, that family member to give you some cash to fund your retirement, etc. But sometimes, if the business has been successful in its own right, there's assets outside of the business from, multiple years of running a successful business, and you don't necessarily need the liquidity, and you'd rather just hand the business off, without taking money out of the business on the way out, and it's more of
Right.
a gift. So in that scenario, there's still structuring things you want to think through about, minimizing taxes, et cetera. And that's working with obviously financial advisor, but even lawyers and trust planning, because it's all part of, your estate. But usually we do find, quote unquote, you know, much less than fair market value transactions to someone, a son or daughter. Sometimes, it's truly at a zero fair market value because it's 100% gift, but it's a
Mhm.
wide range. But we obviously do see, within the family, a much different number for fair market value on that transfer of ownership.
All right, then let's move. That's great. Let's move quickly on here to category three, the ESOP. So kind of
Yes.
explain what that acronym is and what it means, and what it means potentially for both owners and employees.
Yep. No, so ESOP stands for Employee Stock Ownership Plan, and it's a qualified retirement plan that buys and holds and distributes company stock to employees. Really think of it as a tax-advantaged leveraged buyout of your own company. So the company gets a loan from a bank to fund a new entity, the ESOP Trust, which then buys the founder shares at fair market value. And then the company's future contributions to the ESOP are used to repay this loan. So again, on this podcast, it's going to be hard, especially for first-time founders, to maybe completely, understand that structure.
So
You
just
know,
real quickly, quick question.
it's a little bit
Does
complex, and you almost need structure diagrams to see it. But it's a very well-established structure that, obviously. the IRS, understands, and there's tax. I can get into the tax advantages of it, but it's a very well-trodden structure that, honestly, hundreds, if not thousands of companies, around the US have used to transfer ownership to its employees.
So when that bank gets that loan to bond to invest, or when they get to invest in the ESOP
Yep.
and buy the shares from the owner. So does that mean the owner gets their kind of equity out immediately, or is it just a portion? Do they keep shares in the pot, or how does that work for them, or is it kind of go
Again, it's
multiple ways?
highly structured depending on the owner's goals, and it's roughly 20 to 50%, but it can be structured, at any percentage. And you bring up a good point, a bank is not going to provide 100% of the fair market value. They will create a loan based on a loan to value. And again, this is working with a financial advisor. Depending on the specifics of the company, you'll get a certain amount of the fair market value as a loan, but you're not going to get the full amount. The difference then is also usually a seller's note as well. So in this structure, you're not going to get, compared to that first option we talked about, which is, selling up to 100% of your company to a strategic or private equity group.
Hmm.
Here, you're going to get fair market value and you'll get some cash up front with, what the bank provides, but then you're going to get some cash over time through a seller's note is really the best way to think through it. So I'm glad you kind of brought up that question.
Then how does, as employees, how do they start acquiring then ownership components? Is it
Yes. So the ESOP is a trust that theoretically owns the company after this is put in place. And and again, it's complex, and it's why you want to work with someone who has dealt with this. But there's it's really set up as and it's dependent on how many employees are at the company and what each of those employees' salary is. But over time, as the employees continue to work at the company, they get allocated more and more of those ESOP trust shares. And
mhm.
that's how it's structured kind of over time. So
But
the
since the
ESOP
ESOP
trust
owns the
owns it
business, all
originally, and
profits
then
are going into the ESOP from the company now, correct?
yes, yes, yep. And then over time, the ESOP trust distributes shares of the company to the employees as they earn it as they work, at the company for, X number of years. So if that employee then leaves, they're not going to get as much shares as they would if they stayed there through to their retirement, et cetera. So it's, you know, it's it's set up front, but it really is dependent on, how many employees and the structuring of it. But you can think of a trust is who you're selling to, and then that trust distributes the actual ownership to the employees over time.
So no individual owns the trust. Everybody has a share in the trust.
Yes. Yep.
So that's
But
kind of how it
you as
differs
the
from your next
selling
generation.
shareholder, usually it's structured in a way where and a board of directors has to be created, but normally you will be able to still have governance rights over that trust at least for a period of time. So
So
that's
your
the nice
majority shares
structural
are
enhancement. Yep.
acquired.
Yes, exactly.
So
And then
similar to a
other,
situation where you're doing a next gen cell, you still have skin in the game, so you still have decision making power until kind of you've been paid off enough that you don't.
yep, yep. And then what's interesting here is the proceeds you get up front in an ESOP, you can defer or potentially even permanently eliminate capital gains tax through a 1042 rollover, as long as you reinvest these proceeds into US stocks and bonds. And then if you hold those investments, until death, they, at that point would receive a step-up basis and, tax wouldn't even be payable
You can
then.
pass
So it's
on your distributions from the ESOP tax free to the next generation.
correct. Yeah, for the selling founder. Yep.
Huh, interesting.
Yep. And
Well, yeah.
here the purchase price that the ESOP buys the company from you from is at fair market value. And this is determined by an independent valuation. So this does ensure that the founder here does get a fair price. So you're selling your business to your employees and it is at the fair market value. Now you're not going to get all that fair market value day one, as we talked about, because
Hmm.
some of it's going to be, paid back through a seller's note. And you may retain some ownership as well, where you're not selling 100% of your business, but what you're selling is at fair market value, which, versus that second bucket we talked about, which is, just a structured sale to the next generation or, your daughter, or son, is
Hmm.
usually you're selling your business at less than fair market value. But here in an ESOP, you are going to sell your business at fair market value, which, is for most founders, pretty attractive.
All right. So that's three very unique ways to, go about, kind of unlocking value in your business. But we did talk about this a little on the front end. All right, now I am the VP of marketing, and I see my gray-haired owner
Yep.
thinking that he's talking more and more about wanting to go to Southern California. Um, so how do I have those conversations with him? Well, what are the kind of things that, for me that I should be bringing to the attention of my owner?
It's great, great question, Stephen. So I would say be proactive. Have that conversation. Now, if you just joined the company a year ago and you're still proving yourself, or you're not in that trusted position, with the owner, maybe you need to, pay your dues a
Yeah,
little
you got
bit.
to
But
be inside the circle of trust. You don't want to be over
exactly.
here.
But if you feel as if you've created value for the company over multiple years and you're within that circle of trust, you're, a trusted employee, you're someone that, day in, day out adds value, you're part of strategic decisions, you're, like you said, in that circle of trust, you should absolutely be proactive and have that conversation with the owner because some owners just sometimes don't think of selling to that next generation. They just think, oh, well, yeah, I'm going to sell to an outside counterparty. And, they just sometimes you don't realize, all three options as an owner. You kind of just, someone knocks on your door,
And
you're
they
like,
may
oh,
not be
okay,
planning it. I think you'll find that
exactly.
that's why, Brett, you're around is that people aren't experts in this. They need to bring in outside help, and they're busy with their families, running their business. They've got a million other things going on, and all of a sudden the years creep up on them,
Yep.
and they have a decision to make.
Yep. Yep. So,
So if you can be a part of that solution to them to bring some, to be say, hey, look, there is interest from people to acquire this, start
yep.
getting them thinking.
Yep. Yep. And especially if you go to that owner with, with a plan, right? With, a potential and these things are take time to, talk through and there's lots of iteration. But if you show that you're interested in effectuating a transaction with them because you see, the growth opportunities and what's ahead in the industry and you recognize the legacy that's been created by the founder already and you want to, be the one who the torch is passed to continue that on and see different opportunities. There's ways, especially for that, as you said, Stephen, that VP or whoever it is, that person can attract capital either through a bank or a private equity group as well, and still provide that founder liquidity up front, which may be important to that founder. And then, there's just so many ways to structure these transactions. And, the way you structure them is just to start having that conversation and be proactive because it does take time to figure this out. So preparation is everything.
Hmm.
No path, no transaction happens overnight. Thinking through that next chapter just takes time. And so you want to start having that conversation sooner than later. And you want to start having that conversation before, the founder goes down one particular path, because once you get down one path, you kind of get wedded to it, or, there's an opportunity cost to aborting that path. So you want to have that conversation when, that founder hasn't decided anything and you approach him with or her with an idea and you kind of be thoughtful about it And yes, definitely get expert advice. These are complex transactions, so working with an advisor, financial advisor who understands the nuance of each option and, the specifics within ITAD e-waste is critical.
Well, excellent. Well, Brett, this has been very enlightening. I thank you so much. Is there a way that that our listeners here can simply get into contact with you if they need your expert advice?
Yes, yeah. So obviously, Stephen, you have my contact. So if anyone wants to reach out to you and you can connect us, but my email is brett.robinson@fmicorp.com. And yes, we'd be happy to connect. We obviously have a website, fmicorp.com. Feel free to reach out and definitely feel free to reach out through Stephen as well. And if there's anyone out there, even if it's in the early stages of these conversations, happy to learn the specifics and like we talked about up front, each of these are highly bespoke and complex and dependent on the specifics. So happy to talk through some of those considerations.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much again, Brett. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you again the third Thursday of next month.
Great.
Take care,
Thanks, Stephen.
everybody.